Okay, so I think I can assume, or I probably shouldn't, but I might assume that most of us in this room are familiar with the concept of the skills gap, this notion that there's plenty of well-paying jobs in certain industries within an economy, but not enough qualified applicants to fill those positions. It's a narrative that's used frequently and to great effect by policymakers as well as elected officials, both at the federal and state level. Some would say maybe too narrowly focused on the development of things like short-term training programs. There are others, Mark Levine among them at UW-M, who would argue pretty strongly that the idea of a skills gap itself is a fallacy because we don't have a skills gap, it's more of a decent paying wages gap. Our presenter today, Matthew Hora, points to at least an inadequate or misaligned understanding of a skills gap, specific to manufacturing and biotechnology, and he recommends a more nuanced policy reaction. Matthew Hora is an assistant professor in adult teaching and learning in the Department of Liberal Arts and Applied Sciences, which is in the Division of Continuing Studies at UW-Madison. He's also a research scientist at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. Among what I'm sure are several research interests, he specializes in the analysis of how individual decision-making and behavior is influenced by the cultural and organizational context in which people work and study. Along with his co-authors, Ross Benbow, Amanda Oleson, and Amy Wong, he also recently published a WISCAPE policy brief to accompany today's talk, which I think we have a few copies filtering around here, and is available on our WISCAPE website. So with that, let me help me welcome Matthew to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming and for taking the time to listen to my talk. This kind of feels a bit like a slideshow that you give after going on vacation, because Ross and Amanda and I have spent the last 3 years crisscrossing the state of Wisconsin, hanging out in factories and research labs, community colleges, and universities, just talking to people. And so this is a culmination of 3 years of research, so I'm very excited to be presenting our findings today. My talk today is a different take on the skills gap, and I was going to say who I am, but you did a great job. So I will start with, if you're going to leave this talk just with a few ideas that you'll remember tomorrow morning, these are what they are. The centrality of what people call the 21st century competencies are absolutely essential, particularly work ethic and self-regulated learning. That both higher education and workplace training need to change and improve. And in particular, they need to adopt teaching methods and instructional practices that cultivate these competencies. The third point is that education industry partnerships, while there are quite a few, they also need to improve, and in particularly focusing on communications and those types of collaborations that foster cultural and social capital in their students. And I could send slides to people if you're interested, so you don't have to jot down notes. And then finally, and this underlies kind of the core of our study, is that the narrative of the skills gap needs to be reframed. And it needs to be far more comprehensive and collaborative so that we could effectively deal with the complex issues that are facing our society. So those are the 4 main points I'd like to leave you with. Before I start talking about the skills gap, though, I'm going to talk about vegetables. And you may be wondering, why is he going to talk about vegetables? But before I got into education research, I was working on vegetable farms, mostly on the East Coast. And I became fascinated by the idea of a food system, which, if you boil it down, it's the idea that there's a system from production, distribution to consumption, as you can see in this simple graphic here. But once I started to delve into this idea, I quickly realized that this is an overly simplistic and linear depiction of the food system. That once you start to look at things, especially at a regional and national and now a global level of how food is produced and distributed and then consumed, it gets really complicated, such that a graphic like this is far more accurate. Now what you see here is a whole lot of feedback loops between the different components of the food system. And in particular, you have to start layering in issues of the environment, of the economy, of the social sphere, if you really want to understand how the food system operates at multiple levels. So I just wanted to start my talk with this because I developed this way of thinking about complex issues and seemingly simple narratives when I was involved in food systems research, and I've kind of migrated that to education research. So this all starts with the skills gap, which became a meme or a cultural unit, a ubiquitous phrase, right after the Great Recession. And this is natural enough. People were really concerned about jobs, and we lost millions of them. And so you can see there, this is a LexisNexis search of the number of times that the skills gap has been mentioned. And you can see it skyrockets right after the recession. But it wasn't just the loss of jobs that people have been concerned about. There's been a lot of concern about the changing nature of work. And this graph here has been very widely disseminated. It's coming out of MIT. Some labor economists looked at the nature of tasks in the workplace over the last few decades. And I'll just draw your attention to the trend lines going down. These are routine manual tasks, things that you can do when you're on an assembly line, maybe if you're in a research lab, you're just pipetting hour after hour the same routine things. The trend lines going up, on the other hand, are non-routine tasks. The non-routine analytic and interactive tasks. And the way a lot of people interpret this graph is the trend lines going up represent the jobs that robots cannot do. In contrast, the trend lines going down, those are the things that automation and robotics are not going to replace, they're replacing them right now. And so this anxiety about the world of work and this question, are we preparing students at the K-12 level and also in higher ed for this changing world of work is, it's one of the undercurrents to the skills gap question. Now, I want to go over some terminology because this is something that often is ignored when people talk about things like the skills gap or food systems. And Peter Capelli, who's an economist at Penn, wrote this wonderful paper. If you're interested in delving into this more deeply, there's a citation at the bottom. But he makes a distinction between a mismatch, a shortage, and a skills gap. The mismatch is a very general idea that the supply and demand of students and in the labor market are out of sync. Okay, so it's a pretty general, there's two variables going on and they're not aligned. A shortage is a more specific instantiation or example of the skills mismatch. It speaks to something, like we don't have enough welders in Milwaukee, or we don't have enough IT workers in Silicon Valley. Now the skills gap is an entirely different beast. It's a far more expansive story about the lack of skilled employees, but there's a causal relationship to macroeconomic indicators such as high unemployment and slowing GDP. But the other thing that's modeled into the idea of a skills gap is there's an agent or a unit to blame for all this, and that's the educational sector. So if you see the first two, they're not really talking about education per se, and there's not a causal link to who's to blame for these mismatches or these shortages. There's been far more research on the first two in labor economics and very little on the last one. Another important thing to think about is the way people have analyzed these skills problems over time. And I'm not an economist, so this is all new to me, but it was part of the background understanding that we had to develop when we started this study. One of the more dominant frameworks is internal labor markets. And this is the idea that if there's skills problems out there, then a company will deal with it on their own, either by screening people, at the hiring stage, or investing in training. Another framework is market dynamics, that if there's some sort of disequilibrium, it's going to work itself out. Whether you increase wages for those welders, if there's only 3 of them, or something like that. Now this third one, again, it's been far less research, but it's kind of the undercurrent of the skills gap. And that's the idea of an educational supply chain. And what this basic idea is stating is that industry is kind of, they're restricted by what the educational sector delivers to them. Okay, they're kind of captive to the quality of people that are sent their way. So this is a new way of framing these skills-related issues. And again, there's been very little academic research using this last framework, a lot more with the first two. Now, this idea of a skills gap, though, even though there hasn't been much research, hasn't kept it from reaching the highest levels of policymaking and punditry. You can see here, this is the National Business Higher Education Forum. And this quote just neatly encapsulates the way the skills gap is often thought about. Basically, the curriculum and the way things are taught in colleges and universities, they're inadequate. The skills gap idea, as many of you well know, is particularly taken root in the state of Wisconsin. These are two reports that came out in the last several years. One is called Be Bold 2 on the left, the other is Road Ahead on the right, that have been very influential. They've kind of done a scan of the labor market, education in the state, and come to the conclusion there's a skills gap and provided some answers. The one on the right in particular, which was a special report that the governor commissioned, almost directly led to the development of workforce development and some would argue higher ed policy in the state of Wisconsin. And you can see some of that in some of the language that's used. So when the governor goes out and talks about these things, it's often referring to, I've heard from a lot of employers that can't find skilled workers. And there's a skills gap in the state. Now, one interesting thing to think about with the skills gap narrative is it doesn't stop there, that there's not enough skilled workers, employers are struggling. What is often layered into this argument is that there's a certain type of educational institution that is most suitable for dealing with the skills gap. You can see here with the statistic that 70% of the jobs will not require a 4-year degree. It targets the 2-year colleges and certificates and increasingly boot camps as the arena that will most likely deal with the skills gap problem. Now, interestingly enough, this is a bipartisan narrative, and the president has talked about it a lot, and one thing that he has done, as well as a lot of others, have layered in not only that certain institutions are most well positioned to deal with the skills gap, but certain disciplines. And by default, certain disciplines are really not well suited to deal with labor market issues, art history being singled out here. So I wanted to show a quick video. This is from the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. They have done a really good job in promoting the ideas of a skills gap in the state. And you'll see this is a very highly polished video, and it just exemplifies some of the key parts of the narrative.
We go 10 years down the road, it doesn't matter if it's manufacturing, or healthcare, or accounting, or legal services, we're not going to have enough to do anything.
We have a workforce that's aging, and we need to make sure that we can backfill talent in the state to meet employers' needs. And what keeps me up at night is, if you think about our website, Jobs in Wisconsin, we have over 80,000 job postings on that website. And we have an unemployment rate in the state of Wisconsin at 5.5%. And yet we hear employers still articulating that they cannot find the talent that they need to grow and expand and to pay higher wages.
For us, it's really trying to pay attention to what students want and what our employer partners want. So that engagement process and building what we refer to as career pathways that allow an individual student and then an employer to be a part of the educational process, to join in the conversation about what's being taught, how it's being taught, and what the credentials are that when a student comes out that they'll need to get a good paying job.
Right now, we employ about 450,000 people in manufacturing, and unfortunately, people's impression of what manufacturing is out of a 1950s movie, that this is a terrible place to be and you don't want to send your children there. Where in truth, those are some of the best jobs, the best paying jobs, the most rewarding jobs. And so right now, we're talking about the skills gap in manufacturing, because we are such a heavy manufacturing state, that's what we're seeing.
Nobody knows, has a perfect crystal ball that tells you what the jobs of the future are. So what we have to do in higher education is emphasize creativity, critical thinking skills, so when our graduates change careers 5 times in their lifetime, whatever that new growth industry is going to be, they're going to be prepared and be able to adapt to change.
That cycle just begins to repeat itself. And so I think we've got to make that choice right now to say, the more talent we bring in, the more that we can grow, the more prosperous the state of Wisconsin is, the better off we're going to be.
And if we don't get this right, we're looking at economic contraction. You think about it from the private sector perspective, you have 3 choices when you can't find the workers you need. You can automate, which a lot of our businesses are doing right now, investing heavily in it. You can downsize your operation, run fewer shifts, not bid for contracts that you know that you frankly can't satisfy because you don't have the workforce for it, and you can move. And I fear that all three of those are going to be options, and of course the last two are particularly bad because it means that there will be less opportunity for Wisconsin workers. We have to solve this problem, otherwise we're looking at economic contraction for our state.
So there's a lot of ideas wrapped up in this short video. I'd just like you to think about a couple of them as I go through the results of our study. One was the emphasis that the gentleman made about critical thinking and creativity. That's something that you often don't hear in some of the skills gap rhetoric. And also what the gentleman referenced, the three options that a company has when they're faced with the lack of skilled applicants. Either they automate, they retrench, or they move. And so I'd just like you to think about those two ideas as I go through my data and maybe just balance it against these perspectives. So just really quickly wanted to go through some of the labor market data that the statistic that the governor cited is correct, at least according to some analyses out of Georgetown, that almost 70% of the jobs will not require a 4-year degree in the state of Wisconsin. If you look at the breakdown, 38% high school or less, 36% some college, and then the portion in the upper left, that's bachelor's degrees, master's, or PhDs. But one of the things that's often not spoken about are wages and benefits. And so when you look at these data, since 2010, the economy has added 6.6 million jobs. Little under half are considered good jobs. This is in the upper third of the median wage in a particular occupation. And the vast majority of those went to college graduates, people with a 4-year degree. Some other data points, these are full-time. They're twice as likely to have benefits. And a good chunk of them have gone to the managerial professions, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or STEM, and healthcare. And just really quickly, these are some of the projections for the hot jobs in Wisconsin for next year. And I thought I'd go back to 2008 data to see how they balance against more recent projections, and they're almost identical, where you have nursing, truck driving, admin assistants, and on down. But the thing that I'd like to point out is in this column on the right, the educational requirements, you can see the diversity of educational pathways that will be required for some of these hot jobs. There's not just one type of credential or one type of degree that is going to lead people to get these jobs. And of course, you can see the differential in wages there. So when we first started the study, we wanted to kind of figure out, well, what's underlying this idea of the skills gap. The first is this educational supply chain idea. Another is that industry is just having a really hard time finding skilled workers. And that when you look at some of the public policy that's based on the skills gap, and when people talk about it, they're primarily talking about the so-called hard skills, technical skills. And when people do go a little further, it's often just about an occupation. We need more welders, or we need more IT workers. And that these, again, are causing these problems in the larger economy. What's the problem here? Well, it's the educational sector, particularly 4-year liberal arts programs. There's overly academic coursework. Another element of this is that education's not offering enough hands-on learning. It's too abstract, it's too conceptual. And so some of the primary policy responses have been focused on internships and apprenticeships so that students can get more so-called real-world experience. And I'll mention it later, but ironically, this assumption number 4 is something that a lot of learning scientists have been advocating for decades. And so there's kind of a shared commonality of goals and a lot of people advocating for high-quality teaching and learning in some of the skills gap advocates. Another assumption, people use the word alignment a lot, but when they use it, it's one of these sectors needs to align to the other. And primarily that's by allowing industry to come in and help to shape what type of curriculum will be offered, what type of programs will be offered, and also, to a lesser degree, some of the instructional practices. And then finally, this is often not talked about, but underlying most of this is this view of the purpose of higher education is vocational. It's job training. And then lastly, that internal labor market conceptual framework I mentioned earlier, that's not part of this picture. What industry can do to deal with some of these skills-related issues is rarely part of the skills gap discussion. It's all about what education can do. So some of the policy responses in our state, there's been a lot of investments. Starting in 2013, $15 million as part of the Wisconsin Fast Forward Initiative This supported a lot of worker training grants, a new data system, Office of Skills Development, and then there was an additional set of funding in 2014. Now, interestingly, we went and looked at some of the data about the training grants that were provided to employers, and over 50% of them went to the manufacturing sector. But when you looked at the hourly wages of the people participating in these training afterwards, it was $17 an hour in round one and $12 an hour after round two. And so you look at the living wage for a family of four in Green Bay, those are both under that. And this is something analysts that have looked at Wisconsin Fast Forward have noted, that it's targeting one segment of the labor market at the exclusion of the other ones. And that's just something to recognize. While there's been investments, we all know there's been disinvestments. A lot of money cut from the UW system. And through our research, we've been at each of the campuses talking to people as these were unfolding. And this is just two examples of how this trickles down to some teaching and learning related issues. At UW-Platteville, they used to have 2 courses as part of their writing requirement. Now they're down to 1. And at UW-La Crosse, they have an extremely robust undergraduate research experience program. And they lost this amount of money to support that, which for the small program, this is quite considerable. So not everybody likes this narrative. This is Peter Capelli. He's a labor economist. And he talks about how this is an issue where academic research and academic techniques are very rarely seen. Where parties with the material interest in the outcomes have dominated the discussion. A lot of the reports coming out are funded by industry. And then finally, there's been little testing of the assumptions behind the arguments. So we came across his papers as we were starting to understand these assumptions ourselves, and we agreed with this sentiment. That said, there's a whole lot of people interested in skills. Not everybody is talking about the skills gap or poking holes in it. The Partnership for 21st Century Learning is a consortia of the NEA, companies like Microsoft and Cisco, and they're basically advocating at the K-12 sector that diversified skills are more embedded in curriculum and instruction. But some of the most influential work has been done by the National Research Council. And so what they call these 3 types of competencies are 21st century competencies. So they pertain to the cognitive, and this is where some of the technical knowledge comes in, critical thinking, the interpersonal, teamwork and leadership, and the intrapersonal. And so there's a whole lot of work at the national level about how can we teach and then assess these. And you're going to be seeing a major thrust on these competencies in the next decade or 2. In particular, the last 2, the inter and intrapersonal, some people call them non-cognitive, and especially Jim Heckman at Chicago has been doing a lot of research on these, and they're very positively correlated with successful outcomes in school, work, and health. But the key idea is people don't just want students to acquire these, they want them to have the ability to transfer them. So it's not just about teaching students what these competencies are, but they need to be able to go out in the workforce, go out in their families, and out in the community and transfer them. And this is a core idea in the learning sciences, this idea of transfer. And it's very difficult to teach in this way, but it's kind of undergirds this entire idea of 21st century competencies. So the 3 research questions we developed, what skills do employers and educators in Wisconsin find valuable for workplace success? How, if at all, are employers and educators actively cultivating these? How are they teaching them? And then what types of cross-sector partnerships exist and how do they influence skills cultivation? So the theoretical framework we're using, I'll quickly go through this part. If you have any questions later, please ask. It's field theory from sociology and cultural models theory from cognitive anthropology. And basically, instead of looking at sectors as these monolithic kind of contexts where activity happens, we're looking at education and industry as fields. They're bounded social spaces where there's some visible rules and expectations, but a whole lot of invisible ones. And then you have subfields within them, for example, a 4-year university and a 2-year college. And these fields are constantly in interaction with one another, often in conflict, competing for resources, which are called capital. This could either be economic capital, social capital, or cultural capital. And in our study, we're particularly interested in cultural capital, and one type of it is called embodied cultural capital. It's a type of skills and knowledge that you acquire from your teachers, your family, and your cultural setting. And depending on how people acquire different forms of capital, it depends on how they're positioned in the field. So the thing that we're really interested in is in the field of education and industry, how do teachers and employers view the most valuable skills in their field, and then how do they convey them to their students or their workers? And for that process of internalization, how does the individual kind of take on this capital? That's where cultural models come in. This is like a mental model that we all have of how the world works. You know, what's an appropriate breakfast food? What do you do when you walk into a church? But these are things that are shared amongst the social or a cultural group. And so that's how we're looking at the types of skills that people get in school and then go out in the labor market with. These all don't determine human activity, though. People have agency, so they bring their own dispositions to bear on their decisions. And then even though we're not using that educational supply chain idea, we are positing that people, when they go to school, they develop this cultural capital, then they go out in the labor market and hope that somebody wants to buy it. It's the type of social currency that ideally there's going to be employers out there that will want to purchase the types of skills that they have. So that's our framework. What we did, this is a National Science Foundation study, funded study. We talked to 69 educators and 72 employers throughout the state. Those are the 7 regions that we focused on. These are kind of high industry cluster areas that also have some post-secondary institutions. We used a semi-structured interview protocol. It included a free list question, which I'll talk about in a minute, and some open-ended questions. And then we got to hang out at each of the companies, which was probably the best part of the study. So this is the types of skills that people find valuable. And essentially, as we see on the far left column, these are the terms that the entire sample mentioned as the most valuable. The salient score reflects the frequency with which that term was mentioned across the sample and how close to the top of the list they mentioned it. And I should say the question that we asked was, can you name any single words or short phrases that are most essential for success in the workplace? And the idea being, if you're going to mention the first thing you mention is the most cognitively salient versus the last thing you mention. And so the higher the score, the more salient. And so you can see things like technical ability. That was very salient across our entire sample for educators and employers. And this is not surprising. Some of the things that were a little bit surprising to us was how highly valued work ethic was. You can see critical thinking, that was also highly valued across the sample. Oops, go back. And one of the things to notice about these results is they pretty neatly map onto the NRC's framework of cognitive skills, the technical knowledge and technical abilities. The interpersonal is important. You see communication and teamwork up there. And the intrapersonal. And that comes into things like self-motivation and lifelong learning. Now it's important to recognize, though, even though these interpersonal and intrapersonal skills are important, at a bare minimum, employers need some basics, no matter what the job. Okay? It depends on the type of job, whether it's a low-wage production worker or a high-wage electrical engineer. But at the bare minimum, there's some technical skills that people need. You can see here, it's really basics. But this idea that it could be trained, we heard from almost every employer we talked to. Certain things can't be trained, again, like being a quality control engineer, but a lot of them can. And so what people are really looking for is somebody that has the ability and the willingness to be trained, which is a different story. There's a set of employability skills, though, that people also talked about lacking out of graduates. How to turn on a computer, how to use Outlook. A lot of we want PowerPoint skills came from a lot of businesses, which was interesting. And their idea is that these things, people should come into our company with these. And later on I'll talk about some of the boot camps that are popping up, for-profits, that are taking people coming out of mostly 4-year universities that don't have these skills, paying a decent amount of money and getting these employability skills and then going out and getting jobs. But this is a frequent complaint that we heard. But this idea that you can't train people to be trainable, this is just essential for so many employers that we talk to. That there's a personal aptitude and characteristic, a willingness to learn new things, get out of your comfort zone, and take on new information. That they've encountered a lot of people that look really good on paper, they'll say. They have the fancy degree, but they don't have this, and it's really hard to work with. You can see that from this manufacturing supervisor in La Crosse. Spend a lot of time here, so having people that are just horses' asses, for lack of a better word, we don't want them because they're a pain to be around, but it takes away from what they're doing. Now, as Jim Morgan in the video mentioned, a lot of people think of manufacturing as like this Dickens-esque kind of, lots of smoke in a dark room, and there are some companies out there that are just like that. But this idea that mostly people are sitting around problem solving is true in a lot of cases, where you have these really complex assembly lines and stuff's always breaking, or orders are going awry. And so you have these teams of people that constantly need to work together, deal with conflict, and handle problems. And this is something that this individual mentioned. Now this sentiment, of course, undermines a lot of the arguments being made in the skills gap, especially that we need these more technical skills and that'll be it. Clearly there's other competencies that the workforce needs and businesses need. And this person kind of hit the nail on the head. If you can show me how to teach them, well, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? We can teach these things. And so one of the things that we're really emphasizing as we interpret our data, there's two cultural models that are of primary importance for success in the workplace. And again, these are the mental models that individuals carry with them, but are ideally shared within a group, whether it's their peer group or within a company. The first is what educational psychologists call self-regulated learners. And so this speaks to the ability of an individual to have the motivation to learn more, the motivation to study. But they also need to know how to study, which for those of you who are educators in the room, for a lot of students that doesn't come naturally, about how to study in an effective way. And then a key part is self-monitoring. So you monitor your performance, and if there's you need to make a correction, you're going to do it. And then work ethic. This one is great because it's like culture or skills gap. It means 10 different things to 10 different people. But there's been a lot of people studying it, and it's broken down into some specific sub-constructs, including reliability, deferred gratification, and a sense of morals. But probably the most important thing to understand about these two cultural models, especially work ethic, is where do they come from? And this is where when people would talk about it, whether they're employers or educators would say these things and say, I don't know what to do about it. Especially work ethic, it's something that you get from your parents, your family. Do you have adults in your family, in your immediate environment that are modeling hard work, or do you not? Church, society, everything. Heard a lot of complaints about millennials and the internet. But there's influences from all sorts of arenas that are shaping how people think about how do I learn and how do I work. So the second set of data focus on how do educators cultivate these competencies. And overarching all of the educators talking about this was this focus on critical thinking and problem solving and trying to teach students how to be good learners. This by far was more common in four-year institutions or two-year programs where people were strong advocates of general education requirements, which I think most of them were. But there was definitely some who saw the gen ed stuff as being a little superfluous. But this is, by and far what people are focused on. And in terms of how do you teach these, how do you cultivate them, there was a number of people who talked about using things like undergraduate research experiences to teach critical thinking, small group work for teamwork, and having really rigid attendance criteria for work ethic. But I think the more salient point is most of the people in our study didn't talk about the interpersonal or the intrapersonal competencies. Now that doesn't mean that they're not thinking about them. They just didn't talk to them about it with us. But we did look at a number of syllabi and talk to people, well, how are you approaching your instructional design? And these things often are not on the radar screen. And in my other lines of research, I've done hundreds of classroom observations in mostly research universities. And I can attest to the fact that there's a lot of great teaching out there, but there's a lot of really ineffective, not great teaching going on out there as well. And so I think some of our data just point to the fact that when it comes to these 21st century competencies, there's a lot of improvement to be made in higher education. One of the things that's really important to think about, though, when we think about what higher ed can do, it's this issue of time. So this is somebody working with apprenticeships. Just, it's really important that electrical is a difficult trade to learn, and there's no shortcuts. That some of these disciplines, a boot camp may give you the base minimum to get a job and to have these technical skills so you can use a machine. But it takes time to understand the habits of mind about how to be an electrical engineer or a biologist. And that's something that a lot of people just really reinforce. And the other thing is, what about all these gen ed requirements? What about the liberal arts? And so this was a very interesting observation from somebody in Milwaukee, where a lot of companies come and say, why do we need somebody that needs English or history? Your curriculum is so bloated. And that she's had time and again, people will come back and say, you were right. These actually do make good employees. These are people that actually in their English class, they learned how to compose an email without emoticons. They learned how to communicate with people, because when we're dealing with clients, we have to communicate all the time, and these people know how to do it. And then we also had some of the instructors saying, I just can't do this stuff, communication, collaboration, in my courses. It's too packed. So I rely on the general education coursework for that. So how do employers deal with this stuff? Primarily through keeping people out of the company that don't have the skills that they want. It's screening. And they have pretty elaborate hiring practices where they try to ensure that people that aren't going to fit their culture, and this idea of fitting with our culture was it was almost ubiquitous, is the primary way that employers are dealing with skills-related issues. It's not through training. By far the most common training is shadowing, what we called following Bob around for 6 weeks. And then far less, had tuition reimbursement programs, or internally had some sort of formal training program. And these are data that are not outliers. The Manpower Group recently did a global survey and found that employers simply are not doing enough. The statistic on the bottom, only 1 in 5 are providing training to existing staff. So this is kind of the state of affairs, the state of the art in the workplace. And then finally, how do education and industry relate to one another? We've basically found a whole lot of different ways. You have training for employees that are the result of collaborations. You have a lot of curriculum advisory boards that are guiding programmatic directions. And you have a lot of efforts that are developing student competencies. And I'd just like to single out a few of these. This is an example of a co-designed company training where this plastics manufacturer, they wanted to develop a training program, but they knew that they had nobody on staff that understood teaching. So they reached out to the local community college, and they collaboratively designed an online training program that still exists. And so this is a case where the employees are developing new forms of cultural capital, and this company has this training program for the long term. Another is what we call multi-contact programs. These are apprenticeships and internships. And these are where students are developing social capital because they're making new networks in the workplace. And they're also developing new skills. And this is in contrast to programs like career days or field trips where it's just a single point of contact. And this last one, curricular co-construction. An example of this is somebody at La Crosse doing undergraduate research, but they would go out into the local business community and ask for the types of problems businesses wanted solved. Take those problems into their class, and the students would work on that problem the whole semester, and then at the end of the semester would go out and give a presentation to that business owner. And so this is something clearly the students acquiring forms of cultural capital that are relevant to academia as well as the workplace. So our conclusions, it's a little bit more complicated than a skills gap. That we have these fields and they share the sense of the valuable cultural capital or competencies that students need to succeed. But it's not just education's responsibility. It implicates a whole lot of other parties. We need to bolster the ability of post-secondary faculty to teach these 21st century competencies. But, we also need to bolster this in the workplace. And it's not just the ability to teach or train these things, it's the desire to. more companies need to have the desire to do this. And again, this isn't just on one sector that needs to improve, they both do. One of our key findings, again, hiring problems, it's not just that people out there don't have the right skills, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. This issue of screening for fit, we heard from a lot of employers, we just can't pay enough wages. We understand that we're part of the problem. And a lot of places we visited were way out in the middle of nowhere. And they'd say, we understand people don't want to work here or live in this small town. And there's a whole lot of cross-field communications. There's definitely room for improvement, especially with the communications and the student pathways like internships and apprenticeships. But the one thing that we couldn't ignore in this study was the role of the state. And so if you think about this in terms of field theory, you have a field in which education and industry is embedded. And so through the duration of our study, it happened to coincide with some really exciting political times in Wisconsin. And so what we've seen is an attempt to shift the internal logic of the way, especially four-year liberal arts-oriented programs operate, where the primary purpose of higher education is not just job training. And there's been a shift to try to encourage places like this, UW-Madison, to adopt the missions of a technical college. And we've seen that in the attempt to rewrite the UW Charter. And so putting this into this whole picture is essential for understanding skills-related issues, especially in this state at this time. That's about where the investments have been made, primarily in training programs in two-year colleges or short-term boot camps, a lot in advanced manufacturing and far less in the 4 years. So what are some of our conclusions? To meet workforce needs, we basically need to support educators and trainers. This is a non-intuitive result of the study. Maybe it's intuitive to a lot of you. But this idea that teachers are on the front line of cultivating these competencies in the future workers of America it's just the way it is. And these are the people that are doing it. And if we're not supporting them, to me it makes no sense. What the NRC really emphasizes is just, if we want to do this well, it requires systematic instruction and sustained practice. This is not a simple thing. It's not just about writing a week-long certificate program and then hoping students go. You need to really have a sophisticated approach to instructional design, and it takes a lot of time and money. And so if we want to do this well, we have to do a little bit better job of investing in the way we approach teaching and learning. The second thing is that self-regulation and work ethic are absolutely foundational. This is something that's often not talked about when we're talking about instructional design, but it's hard. It's really hard to do. It doesn't mean that I don't think we should not do it in higher education, but it's an uphill battle because a lot of these things have been habituated or socialized from a very young age. The third conclusion is that we need to support multiple pathways, but there's some trade-offs, especially in terms of the time students are in a program and how exposed they are to multiple disciplines. So we have a 4-year degree. It's long, it costs a lot, but students do get exposed to a variety of disciplines and ideas, and yet they still maintain a disciplinary focus. So this is one model. Of course, a 2-year degree is shorter, it's less expensive. You're still going to get some general education exposure, but it's far more focused. This is another model. And the model that is rapidly emerging, largely because I think the first arrow up there is kind of not filling a niche, is certificates and boot camps. These are very short, sometimes they're cheap, sometimes they're surprisingly expensive, and they're only focused on a single field. And these two that I mentioned down here, Koru and Fullbridge, they've attracted oodles of venture capital funding, because what they're doing is they're offering those employability skills that I mentioned earlier. And they're finding there's a huge market of college graduates that feel like they don't have the skills to get a job. Not the technical, but the other stuff. So my main argument is that we need to understand and appreciate there's not just one route to a good job in the 21st century, but we need to be a little bit more nuanced in supporting all these different pathways. The fourth, employers need to invest more in training. And this is something I think a lot of people in industry recognize. This is a quote from somebody in WMC saying that successful manufacturers have figured this out a long time ago. And I was fascinated by it. That should be continuous learning. I was fascinated by his use of that phrase because that's educational jargon. But a lot of people recognize that companies need to have kind of their internal lifelong learner support system if we want to do this well. Another conclusion, there's multiple forms of cross-sector relations, but especially communication and student pathways are critical. We talked to an awful lot of educators and employers who had no idea who was in the other side within their city. Companies who had never spoken to somebody from their local technical college or university, and vice versa. And there's a lot of desire, I don't know how heartfelt it is, but there's a lot of desire to correct that. And then internships and apprenticeships. These are just some of the richest learning experiences that you can offer to a student. The ability to develop your academic skills as they're applied out of school settings. And so this is something I think that definitely should be pursued. So the skills gap idea is a distraction and needs to be retired. It's definitely still dominant and you still hear about it. Why should it be retired? Well, the labor economists that have studied this have found no evidence, zero, that it leads to some of those macroeconomic indicators. It ignores teaching, it assigns blame, and it, in my view, and based on our data, it represents an overly narrow view of all of these issues we've been talking about. And one of the questions that is so rarely addressed or asked in all of these conversations is, what's the point of all this? What's the purpose of higher education? And the way the debate's often framed, it's as binary. It's for job preparation, or it's for civic and moral engagement and all that intellectual stuff. And increasingly people are saying it's not an either-or proposition, it's a both and. And part of our argument is that if we want to address these 21st century competencies, it has to be a both and. And we go back to, Thomas Jefferson when he was advocating for the University of Virginia in 1818, talking about we need to promote the interests of agriculture, manufacturers, and commerce, and develop the reasoning faculties of our youth, enlarge their minds. He was also an advocate for not a fixed curriculum, that students would have the freedom to wind their way through the arts and the sciences and all the disciplines to develop these capabilities. And in the end, industry would benefit. I also came across a wonderful AERA presidential address by Lauren Resnick in 1987. She's a very well-known learning scientist. And her argument is there's a broadly enabling role that schooling can play with respect to the economy. That if we could really enrich schooling from K-12 all the way to higher ed and infuse it with the rich learning experiences that we as learning scientists know exist, it's going to help the economy. In this paper, it's great. She also does a really nice analysis of how ineffective a lot of job training programs are. It's basically the same rote memorization, direct instruction that a lot of schools use. So my final kind of soapbox pronouncement is that to meet the state's workforce needs requires a vision and a plan similar to founding father Thomas Jefferson. And that continuing to ignore teaching for transfer is ultimately doing a disservice to lots of parties involved. So we have some specific policy recommendations. The first probably won't make me some fans in this room, but it's to establish new requirements for teachers at the post-secondary level. As a lot of you well know, a lot of faculty are not required to be formally trained in how to teach. The WTCS system has some requirements, but they're not terribly extensive. To be a UW faculty, ideally you were a TA, but there's no formal requirements that you've taken some formal instructional design coursework. And I think that needs to change. But there shouldn't be yet another requirement larded onto institutions of higher learning. Somebody needs to fund this, how to design them well and then how to deliver them well. The third is increased funding for some of these units, which when there's budget crises in higher education, these are the first to go. Career counseling, centers for teaching and learning, and internship programs. These need to be infused with a huge boost of funding. And all that leads to, of course, we need to increase state support for these two systems. And then finally, to reframe the debate. It's an overly divisive rhetorical framework that we're operating under right now at the state and the national level. And if we want to have a productive approach to dealing with these complicated issues, that needs to change. So our next steps, we're going to be taking this study that was based in Wisconsin to 4 different regions in the country, looking at the energy industry, IT, and healthcare in Seattle, Denver, Raleigh, and Houston. And then one thing I'm really excited about is a pilot study next spring in China, because a lot of these narratives are unfolding across the world, especially in East Asia, where there's a huge concern about, are we training our workers for the 21st century economy? But the response has been to cut lots of liberal arts and humanities programming. And so I'm just really curious about a comparative analysis. We're also developing a blended course, half online, half face-to-face, where teachers, faculty, and technical colleges and 4 years can learn how to teach some of the skills I've talked about. And most importantly, this is a team effort, Amanda, Ross, and Amy. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to get in touch, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions now.